Welcome to A Parent's Guide to Child Development. I'm your host, Anna-Marie Ron Furley from Fledglings Flight. Each podcast, we strive to give parents the tools they need to help their child thrive through conversations with experts in child development and psychology, where you can learn about the most important information that you didn't know existed. Today, we're exploring how the choices families make in their child's first 3 years of life can set them up for success in school as teenagers. We will explore the long arc from early play to academic performance. I'm joined by Dr. Dominique Padurano, founder of Crimson Coaching. Since 2014, she's helped hundreds of students through tutoring, test prep, and college counseling in order to unlock each child's unique potential. In this episode, we'll discuss practical, parent-friendly steps you can start this week to build focus, self-regulation, and love of learning so today's toddlers become confident, capable teens of tomorrow. Welcome, Dominique. I'm so excited to talk to you about this topic.
Thanks so much, Anna-Marie. I'm really excited to be here.
This conversation actually bridges Fledglings Flight, which really focuses on children 0 to 3 years old, and my 17-year-old mother needs. So I have a 17-year-old who's starting the college process. So I'm like, feels very relevant to me right now.
Awesome. Well, I hope it's personally as well as professionally useful to you. Good.
Thank you so much. Yes, I will be able to reflect on my choices I made when he was under 3 and see whether or not this is going to, if they're going to help him right now.
So,
You specialize in tutoring and test prep for teens. How are the struggles that the teens have today different than the ones that you saw 10 years ago when you founded your business?
um, I founded Crimson Coaching in 2014, but I have been teaching teens since 1997. So I have a real long arc in terms of learning about teens. I was a classroom teacher for 10 years. And especially relevant to that cohort, many of whom, by the way, are themselves parents now. Um, I see big differences in two main areas. One is focus, and the other one is in literacy. And
Mm.
personally, I'm not a researcher in this area. I think it's both. They're both linked to greater digital use, and which I'm sure we're going to talk about later in the interview. But yeah, focus and literacy are the two big things.
Yeah, that was, my next question was, what do you think the reasons are for the changes in such a short amount of time? And cell phones, I think you and I are probably the same age. Graduated in high school in 89 and my first
Yeah,
degree in 93. So we're the same age. So there
yeah.
weren't any cell phones when we were,
Or
when
even
they were.
email.
Yeah, so did spend time on landlines though, for sure, but limitations on how much you can talk on the phone for sure, versus all of the distractions available to teens now digitally.
Right. And there was a limitation in how far the cord would go for your
Right.
privacy, right?
Right. And your parents for sure would be like, you have to get off the phone. I'm expecting a call.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah, so I mean, these other people who are researchers certainly have done work in this area, and one of the most prominent people is Jean, and I'm not sure how you pronounce her last name. It's spelled Twenge, and she has done a lot of research around the connection between teens social media or digital use, because that could also include gaming and things like that, and their less time spent reading texts that we might have read when we were kids, and focus. And I want to just kind of put an asterisk around focus, because certainly another kind of reason that we might think we see more in terms of diminished focus is because the diagnoses of ADHD is, of course, we're as educators, we're all more aware of it now, whereas before in 1997, It might have been, I might have viewed a boy or girl acting up in class as just a bad apple, right? Or as just, maybe we might even say hyperactive, but we weren't really looking at it as a disorder itself, especially as a disorder that could be treated, right?
Right.
And so, however, the students who were like that, I can sort of think, in my whole career spanning from, say, 1997 to 2012, I can count those kids on one hand as
Right.
sticking in my head. Now, I have as many students who have some sort of attention deficit in one semester of working one-on-one with them. And I have many fewer students now. Usually I'm only working with max 20 students at one time. Whereas as a high school teacher, I was working with 125 students a year.
Mhm.
So in the 90s, I was seeing many more students, and yet I still had many fewer students with focus problems.
I wonder if any of that has to do with the fact that there might be more awareness on the parents' part to get support for their children with ADHD, where in the past, like you didn't know, the parents didn't know what they didn't know, right? So of course there wasn't support for them because it wasn't even, it was a thing. I mean, obviously people had
Right.
ADHD, whatever, but there wasn't the awareness amongst parents and educators about this. And my son has ADHD, so I'm living it. I'm living
Yeah,
it.
right.
But
You're
for a long time, he wasn't diagnosed, right? So, and that was that whole time. He probably wasn't diagnosed until he was like 10.
Yeah.
So all that happening, all of that school career before then, um, there was the whole thing like, well, he's just a boy and this is what boys do or whatever. But, the excuses that people have made in the past because they didn't have any other way to explain it, right? So,
Right. And now I think there's also three reasons why parents are more likely to pursue a diagnosis. One, as you mentioned, there are more supports, so they might, get supports in school. Two, if they have a designated diagnosis that also comes with added time on tests,
right.
when they get to my level where they're studying for the SAT or ACT, that can be a real game changer in student scores. And I have personally witnessed that. And three, because it's so much more common, there's less stigma now around these sorts of diagnoses than there was a generation ago.
Yeah. And then I also wonder, like, um, with digital distractions, like those trying to figure out how I'm trying to say this, thinking on the fly. So, um, people who have a diagnosis of ADHD, you can understand how digital distractions can be
Course.
an issue for them, right? But now it seems like they're an issue for everyone. So you don't even have to have an ADHD diagnosis, and you have neurotypical children who are still screen addicted, right? And then how it trains the brain to need to jump from thing to thing so quickly that it just doesn't have that endurance to focus on anything for a long period of time.
That's right. And to be fair, I think part of the reason we're seeing the skyrocketing rates of ADHD among younger people, especially, is because their brains are still developing, right? So
Mhm.
even though you or I might notice, oh, wow, yeah, I seem to be a lot more distracted lately, our brains were fully developed before the advent of all these digital distractions. And so that's why I am and if I could tell parents of 0 to 3s one thing, it's please keep your child off the phone, off social media, off screens for as long as you possibly can. And even beyond, uh, it's very common, at least on Long Island, where I grew up, where I have family, for students to get a cell phone when they enter middle school.
Right.
There's greater independence from the parents. The parents want to be able to keep in touch with the child. And then also there's the peer pressure, even if the parent isn't so warm to the idea, well, everyone else is doing it, mom, so why can't I have one too? And even those 3 or 4 year differences between 12 and 15 or 16, that makes a big difference. So if you can every additional year, you can hold off getting your child a cell phone is a huge benefit to their cognitive development.
Yeah, that you're say it. That's amazing. Yes, I this should be just be like a ringtone on every parent's phone for sure. Yeah. So when teens struggle with focus, what patterns have you observed in motivation and self-regulation that differentiate them from earlier cohorts?
So this is also, the new cohort for me personally as an educator also corresponds with me having a one-on-one environment of tutoring versus earlier in my career, I had a class of say anywhere between 15 and 25 students, right? And yet one would think that it would be much easier for students to pay attention when they're the only person with the teacher, right? But shockingly, it's not.
Yeah.
And I will say clearly there is some bias because if I have 25 students to attend to and one is zoning out, I might not know, right? If they're lost in the train of their thought. Okay. However, I do notice things, everything ranging from me having to repeat my directions to a one-on-one student 3 or 4 times to them texting their friend because if they're on a Mac like I am, they've got iMessages on their laptop, right? And I mean, this literally happened with a senior in high school while we were working on his college essays. I hear the whoop sound of a message being sent. And so I said, so and so, could you please stop sending texts? And he said, oh, okay. And then he proceeded without turning the sound off on his laptop to send about 9 more messages during a single session, which only lasts about 50 minutes. And so his utter inability to refrain, and he has diagnosed ADHD. And my role is not to be policewoman, which is part
Yeah.
of the reason I left the full-time classroom because that gets really old after a decade. It's we kept on going, but I wondered how much he got out of the session. And interest this is you didn't ask about this, but I feel like this is sort of related. If you're working with an experienced educator, I won't say old, I'll call myself experienced,
We're not old.
who, I had told the mom, I think so and so, your son, needs because we had reached the November 1 early application deadline, and yet there were still applications due on January 1st, but it was the first week of November. And I said, I think your son needs a couple of weeks off. Why don't you, instead of scheduling with me on November 3rd, schedule with me on November 13th or so and just give him a break, right? And the mom did not follow my advice, scheduled with me on November 3rd, and that's when the texting occurred. And so, of course, I contacted the mother to tell her that this was going on because I thought it wasn't productive use of their money. And it was a little rude, to be
Mhm.
honest with you.
Yeah.
So she said, and I reiterated, I think he needs a rest. And I think sometimes, and these are obviously very high income, very high performing school district, they themselves can go, 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 go. And I think they underestimate the needs of their child who does have ADHD for a rest, for a break, right? And so after this, she had her son apologize to me and waited 2 weeks to schedule his next appointment. And then it didn't happen again.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's hard because as a parent who's it's getting entering this zone of this time period where it just feels so very high stakes, you know. And it doesn't have to be, but you know, how well they do on an SAT may or may not affect where they can get in, depending on at the school looks at those scores or not, right? Takes those into consideration. But you know, it's that is that crunch time, right? Is from like junior through halfway through senior year where it's just like it's go 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 and on top of that you're the student you're talking about is not only dealing with his own academic work and keeping the grades up, right, but
Right.
has to write the essays and
Right.
also like if they're still trying to bring up their SAT scores taking the test over and over and over again and just like yeah, he needs a break. It's a lot. It's a lot.
He does. And I think sometimes to your point, that go, 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 that knowledge of we really only have till first semester senior year to wrap this all up
Mhm.
is what's catalyzing the mom's anxiety, right? But again, I've been doing this a long time. I'll be honest and say, look, we have time. We have 8 weeks. You can get what needs to be done in 6 weeks, and your child really needs a break, and the results ultimately will be much, much better when that student has a break. It's the same thing when we start, right? I always tell, a lot of parents want their child to start their essays right as junior year ends or even before junior year ends. And I always say, look, that second semester of junior year is very stressful for the student. They need to decompress at least 2 weeks after the end of school. Look, if the family has financial needs, I get they might need to be working, but most of the time when they're seeking me out, that's not an issue for them. So I say, let them decompress, let them hang out with their friends. And then depending on when school ends, I'm coming from a New York framework. By about July 4th, have them get in touch with me. And as long as they have 2 months of meeting with me once per week during the summer, they're going to have their main Common App essay done. They'll probably have several supplemental essays done, and they'll be able to enter senior year with not that much left to do on the application so that they can, to your point, keep those grades up because that is really the most important factor in college admissions anyway.
Yeah. How do early executive function deficits, such as organization and planning, impact students' academic performance as teens?
Well, it's funny. I will tell you a story about this student named Sam. And Sam is, obviously I'm not going to use his last name. I don't even remember it because it was from the last school I taught at. And he was a ninth grader. And ninth graders in general, by the way, especially boys, still struggle a lot with any kind of executive function. And so if families don't know what executive function is, it's sort of the ability of the prefrontal cortex, the planning center of the brain, to do things like regulate one's emotions in real time, but also time management, organization of materials, and things like that. And as a history and social studies teacher, I would always assign some sort of homework, and then I would go around in the beginning of class and check just to make sure the student had their homework. And I noticed two things about Sam. So one, I would tell students have a section in your notebook dedicated to history. And when he did have his homework, there would be algebra right on the other side. And so I'd say to him, if you're doing your homework in your algebra notebook, when it comes time to study for my test, how are you going to know where to find your notes? Uh, and he was sheepish. He was a good kid. And then the other part would be he sometimes he'd have to make like a deep dive into the recesses of his backpack. And he'd be like bringing out yesterday's, Cheetos wrapper and like all these other things. And then his homework would come out as like this crumpled piece of paper. I'd have to like open it up. And so that is to say, um, students with executive function difficulties have a lot of difficulties keeping track of physically where their work is. A lot of times you'll hear students say, but I did it. I just don't know where it is, or I did it, but it's on my printer at home. And look, this happens to all kids at some point. But the thing that distinguishes the kid with ADHD or a deficit from a neurotypical child is that's the habit more, that's the rule more than the exception to the rule, right?
Right, right, right.
So that's what and of course for students who for classes where homework counts, that can also often be a real boon to their GPA. But when you're not able to keep track of your work, you know, you lose those points. And then the other thing is time management, not realizing that you have a major project due until the night before, and then you're keeping mom up until 3 a.m. because you only started working on it, at 5 p.m. the day before it was due when it was assigned a month ago.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Not really understanding that every bit of it, that it's a multi-step thing. So it's like, oh, yeah, it'll only take me an hour. But then, like, oh, it's a paper. You have to do an outline, and then you have to do a rough draft, and then you need to edit it. And then you have to look for your, do your research, make sure and so, like, that's not an hour. Like, none of that happens in an hour, right?
That's right. And there's two reasons why students may procrastinate. One is a lot of times they're actually perfectionists. And perfectionists often don't want to get started on a task because they feel they won't live up to their idea of what their work should be. So it's easier to just not start at all. And the other kind of student will be the one with executive function deficits. And, when I work with students on study skills and organization and planning, I take them through, okay, this is what your project is. Let's break this down into 5 smaller tasks,
Mhm.
right? And then estimate how long each task will take. And then this is the part that students hate. I make them double it because I say we always underestimate how long something is that we don't want to do, right? And I'll make them keep track of, well, you thought it would take an hour. It We're going to budget 2 hours in your schedule and then keep track. If it only took an hour and a half, then you can just multiply it by 1.5 times next time when you're setting your schedule, right?
Yeah.
And spreading that out over their entire, say, month, if it was given a month. And then the other important thing is I teach them to budget in a buffer. So the due date for them will be 2 days before it's due. And they're like, well, why not? Well, what if you get sick? What if you have an emergency orthodontist appointment? Whatever it is, and you can't work on it that day, then you have a buffer so that you can still get it in on time. And these are things that neurotypical children can often do on their own by the time they get to high school. But the things that the neurodiverse, or I would also say slightly immature student can't do on their own. And so they really do need an adult taking them through that process. And I think, I do feel real compassion for them because sometimes the parent who's mainly in charge of the child rearing can get very frustrated because they've been seeing this all through middle school, but they don't realize their child just really isn't able to do it without that additional support. And that's where, someone perhaps like me might come in.
Right, right, right.
Yeah.
What early language experiences are linked to stronger teen writing and communication?
Well, I have three pieces of advice on this front. Read, read, read. And of course, you're not going to ask your 2-year-old to read, right? And so in the beginning, you'll be reading to your child, right? And I have a 3-year-old niece now, and my brother will send pictures of her. And one of the cutest pictures of her is her holding a book upside down in her little couch chair. And she's just like this. And it's great because it's showing that she loves books and she doesn't have siblings yet. So she's sitting in her little chair reading, right? And then even when a child has reading difficulties, like my second niece, her older cousin did, when she was about 6, she was still having a lot of trouble reading. So I would read to her picture books. And then she had a story that she really liked, which tickled me because it was my favorite book as a child. And I gave her this book. And then she remembered the story through the pictures. And she read by narrating the book and praising the child for that effort, I think is really, really important because I think some parents might get really worried. My middle niece was 6 at this point, and they would think, well, the 6-year-old should be able to read this picture book. But again, she wasn't. And so having her interact with this textual material in whatever way she could is so important. And now, ironically, she's a better reader. She's now 12. She's a better reader than her older sister, who never had those problems.
Mm.
And so I think it will pay dividends to, she reads independently. She often, it's very cute, she'll read the same book as her friends. And they almost have like a 12-year-old unofficial book club of sorts. Their choice was a little alarming to me once. They were all reading a book about Typhoid Mary, and I was like, that's interesting. But, again, and that's the other thing. Try not to. I remember even when my own brother, and this is going all the way back to the 70s, did not want to read as a first, second, third grader. And he loved sports. And so my mother got a bunch of books about baseball and football and basketball out of the library that were age appropriate.
Yeah.
And that got him reading. So choosing a subject that the child loves first. And that should translate even up. I just had this conversation with a 10th grader who's trying to increase his SAT scores, but told me he only has read 2 books outside of school, ever, ever, like in his whole life. And so I was like, wow. And I said, well, what are you interested in? And he told me civil and aerospace engineering. I said, okay. So I went to everybody's new best friend, ChatGPT, and I said, can you give me a fictional book that's appropriate for a 15-year-old who likes civil or aerospace engineering? And it came out with The Martian. So, as part of his homework, he's got to read The Martian on his own, right? And so, developing from an early age a love of and habit for reading will address not only the literacy issues I talked about, but also the focus issues, because reading longer books develops focus.
Yeah, that's so smart. Reflecting back on with my son, I took him to the library every other week and we checked out books and we would get out the maximum number of books that you could check out and we would go through them. And two things that I think why that was beneficial. He's an avid reader. He just turned 17. He asked for nothing but books. He had 30 books on and nothing else.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So I think two things. So as a working parent, when he was little, like our time together was precious because there wasn't as much of it as it would have been if I was a stay-at-home mom. And that time we went to the library together was our time together. So there was this association of happiness and, well-being and feeling loved and connection with going to the library. And then when we came back with the book, spending the time together, it was again just the two of, so he got my full attention because we're looking at the books together because in the beginning he couldn't read them.
Of
And
course.
and he only wanted reference books. So like we're not getting age appropriate books, but like he's wanting me to read him. Like he loves dinosaurs and he's wants to be a paleontologist now. And that
Oh,
passion started young. And so he was intrinsically motivated to seek out this information because he was interested in it, and I kept feeding it, which just became this virtuous cycle, right? So,
yeah.
um, and so even though the books were too hard for him, my reading them to him, to your point, it helped him just love reference books, loving reading, loving that time. And I think the other thing that parents can do, and similar to what I did, is like if you set aside like an hour, half an hour of every days where everybody reads or we read together, that's that same thing where now this is what we do now. This is our time to read together. And I think that bonding and all of that makes happy associations with reading, right?
That's right. And another thing that I've recommended to parents. Oh, this I think will especially work well over, say, a summer when school's not in session, is families can all read the same book and have
Mm.
a little book club among the family. And I think it's really important that you let the children pick the book so that you are showing interest in what they're interested in, which is, to your point, what you were doing by reading that reference book about dinosaurs to your son, right? And then you can ask those same questions that I might as a tutor of a fifth grader struggling with reading, right? So what did you think about this character? What did you think that character was going to do? Or if you're in the middle, say, of the book, after a chapter, what do you think this character is going to do in the next chapter? Ask them to make predictions based on what they're reading, right? And a lot of times parents will say, well, what does that do? Well, again, looking forward down the pike to SAT, the biggest question type that students struggle with is drawing inferences from a text because the answer is not in the black and white on the lines. It's in between, it's in the gray, in between the lines. And so that is a really upper level thinking skill. And Bloom's taxonomy, which is, sort of this taxonomy of cognition, really, that's an upper level thought process that if you are just trying to develop an as a 15-year-old and you've never done that your whole life, well, that's well nigh impossible, right? So developing that at a younger age, I think, is crucial.
Yeah, and it'll also give you like a really good real-time analysis of your child's reading comprehension. Like if there's something that is pretty obvious in the text and they didn't pick it up, and then you're like, interesting. Because like kids with ADHD tend to skim, right? They skip words and whatnot. And so they do a lot of sort of piecing together things because they're not reading every single word. Or at least that was my son. He was sort of skipping over things.
That's right. And in general, this is another thing you didn't ask about, but say Kindle versus book.
Mm.
There's a lot of studies that show that reading from a physical book slows us, everybody, down as readers because we are so used to reading on the web where, you're not going to read every single line or word in a New York Times article, let's say. You're going to read it even as a mature reader to get the gist of it. But when you read from a book, that is slowed down. Um,
Mm,
the other way that you can get a really good handle on your child's reading comprehension is by asking them to write. And this is where the reading and writing really go hand in glove. And again, that middle niece I was just talking about who struggled as a sixth grader, she was still struggling last summer when she was 11, and my sister asked me to tutor them, and I did tutor them, and both of my nieces, and I read some of my niece's writing, and I noticed that she was spelling the same words in different ways.
mm,
And both wrong. And I asked her, we were in the same room. I said, can you pick out the spelling error in there? And she said, well, I know that it's not right, but I don't know how to fix it. And
mm.
I'm not a specialist in special ed. I've just been a teacher for so long. So I said to my sister, I think she might have a visual processing disorder. And it turns out it's not a disorder, but she does struggle with that. And so that might be the first step to getting her help, right? And so the writing is really key, whether it's your child struggling with, um, you know, some students have dyslexia, right? That goes undiagnosed until they're 15, 16 years old, right? And if you think that might be an issue, but you're not qualified to say, I mean, certainly I say go to the school and see whether they can be tested. Schools often will balk because it's very expensive. This type of it's called neuropsychiatric testing. But it's the only thing that can definitively tell whether your child has a diagnosed learning disability, which, like ADHD, if they have a different type of learning disability, they can get extra time on tests and support that will help them manage or even overcome that disability.
Yeah, it's really important because you don't know what you don't know, right? And so, in addition to ADHD, he had visual tracking issues. So one eye was in one place and the other one did all the work.
Yeah,
And when he had neuropsych testing when he was 9, the person who did the testing was like, I think something's going on with his eyes. And we're like, huh? He like literally had just come from the pediatrician. He had 20/10 vision. And I was like, so, but I did it. I took him to a developmental optometrist and he's like, check this out. This eyeball's not moving at all. I'd been staring in his face his entire life, never realized that his eyes weren't tracking. But upon reflection, after that diagnosis, realized why that he didn't want to play ball sports. He had no depth perception. So everything, so he didn't want to do that. And I think he liked the reference materials because they're short paragraphs. It's not like a long narrative they had to follow, so he could just get that information. And there's great photograph of him at the beach with my husband. We're from Los Angeles, so the beach is close by. And my husband had thrown him a soft frisbee, and there's this picture of him, and he's like, the frisbee's here. He doesn't know if that's 2 feet away or about to hit him in the face. But it explains so much. And if
that's
we'd
right.
never had the neuropsych testing, we never would have gotten his eyes fixed or had him do the exercises to strengthen his eyes. This would have been permanent. And then he would have been a driver that would be smashing into things because he would have no idea. So you don't know what you don't know. So it's important to pay attention and look for those red flags.
And I also think it's important to sort of, when someone, an educator tells you something, to another example I have of, so I tutored a boy who was 12 many years ago. And, dad was a single dad, spending quite a bit of money on me. At that point, I think I was about 44 or so, and had taught for a while. And I said, after meeting with his son for about 2 or 3 times, I said, look, have you ever considered that your son might have ADHD? This is what I'm seeing. One, two, three. And he said, well, his teacher, who's only 24 and has 30 kids in the class, mentioned it. But I just figured, she didn't know what she was talking about because she was young, or maybe
Yeah.
because she had a lot of kids in the class. And I said, well, look, I'm 20 years older, have been teaching 20 years longer than her, and one-on-one with your student and with your child, and he's exhibiting these symptoms. I would think about getting him tested, maybe. I'm not saying for sure. I'm a doctor of history, not of neuropsych. So you have to go to a qualified person. Well, sure enough, 6 months later, he has me over to a social event at his home. And he takes me aside and he said, I can't thank you enough because you have changed my family's life.
Oh.
He's now on a regimen of neuropsych drugs, diet, and exercise. And it has completely changed our family dynamic because obviously, as you probably know, the ADHD is not only manifesting in school subjects, it's also manifesting at home in different ways, right? And so, since that time, I've sort of unofficially diagnosed 6 different students ADHD. And, when the parents are receptive, and nowadays most of them are, it can be transformative. And I also want to say, and now the child isn't suffering, because I
Mhm.
think
Right.
children suffer when they have this disorder. Their self-esteem can suffer because they
Yep.
think, what's wrong with me that I can't do everything that my friends can do or that my sibling can do. And it breaks my heart as somebody who cares about kids that undiagnosed disorder could lead to those outcomes.
Yeah. Looking ahead to adolescence, which early childhood practices yield the strongest dividends for teen academic trajectories, and what concrete steps can parents start taking now?
So I think we've talked about 1 and 2 quite a bit. I give this talk sometimes at public libraries called "So You Want to Go to an Ivy League College?" And a lot of times I will have students as young as 5 in the audience.
What?
Yes, yes. At some of these places in New York where, these parents really want their kids to succeed, right? And so I start with the pillars. It's really a three-legged stool. It's focus, literacy, which we've talked about, and numeracy. So
Oh,
since,
numeracy.
yeah, so since we've already really talked about the focus, developing literacy, we haven't talked so much about numeracy. And, you can take the same kind of baby steps when the child is young, right? Anything from, learning their numbers, obviously, when they're little. And again, praising early efforts. So, you know, I get these videos of my 3-year-old niece, and one of the recent ones was her being on the slide. And you know how you'll sometimes count, okay, on a count of 3, you'll go down the slide, right? And so my brother was off camera filming her, and she was like, 1, 2, 3, 14, 27, 100, and that's great, right? Because she counted to 3. And that was developmentally appropriate. And then I think beyond that, when the students do know their numbers, trying to integrate numbers into daily life. So I can remember, strolling my oldest niece when she was about 2 or 3 around the block in my sister's neighborhood. And we would look at the numbers and she would tell me what the numbers were on people's homes or mailboxes. A little bit older, if you're cooking with your child, cooking, and my mom was a home ec teacher. And, obviously cooking and math are so related, especially with fractions, which oftentimes a lot of students have trouble with. And so trying to kind of say, okay, half a cup, well, that's the same thing as 2/4 of a cup, right? Or, whatever, trying to make that fun and thinking about conversions when you're out shopping. Well, says it's a 10% discount. I mean, I have literally had teenagers reach for their phone and on the calculator have to do 10% of 200 on a calculator because they couldn't do that in their head, right?
Yeah.
I know that this will sound incredibly frightening to a lot of people, as it did to one of my students, but I was once tutoring the daughter of a Harvard classmate, and the husband was also a Harvard grad. And so bright parents, right? Kid went to the best private schools in New York City, and we were going over an SAT problem, and I said, well, you multiplied 6 by 7 wrong. And I said, what's 6 by 7? And she went, oh, 41. And I went, you don't know your 6 or 7 times tables. And so I started quizzing her. She didn't know the eights or nines either. And that is very common among this generation. And so, I told her about road trips, vacations with my parents. My dad would be driving the Winnebago and would shout back to my brother and me, 6 times 9, or, and we would have to shout back. And she said, that sounds so frightening to me. And I said, well, look, if you do not want me to tell your parents about this, you have one session to memorize those times tables. And she was 16. So making sure your child knows these fundamentals at the appropriate time, because they should not be learning their times tables at 16 when they're trying to get a 1500 on the SAT.
Yeah. Yeah, because with math it's cumulative, right? If you
Right.
don't know the foundational things, you can't do the higher level concepts, right? Because they all build on each other.
That's right. So if you don't know your times tables, fractions are very difficult, right? And then algebra becomes even more difficult. So, and if you don't know algebra, you can't do, calculus. And so it is all cumulative. And so kind of, I can recommend I have it on the resources page of my website. I don't have any stake in this publishing company, but I love it's something like the Big Fat Math Workbook, and it's geared for middle school students. And I think, if your child is heading towards high school and you're not sure if they know what they need to know in math, making them go through that Big Fat Math Workbook, which the book itself is this big, but it is fat, is a great little investment that you could even do over the summer with them.
Fantastic. Well, we're going to get close to wrapping it up here. So, if there's one thing that parents should take away from this conversation, what would you want it to be?
To remember that three-legged stool, the focus, literacy, and numeracy, but also to approach that with an open mind and really, if someone like an educator is telling you, hey, look, I see this going on with your child, don't dismiss it out of hand because the teacher's 24 or, may not look like what you think a teacher should look like or in any respect, right? That if you approach your child's education with an open mind, I think that is most likely to yield the best outcome for your child. And ultimately, that's really what every parent wants, I'm sure.
Yeah, fantastic. How can parents get a hold of you?
Best way is to go to my website, crimsoncoaching.com. crimsoncoaching.com/contact, or if you just go to crimsoncoaching.com, there's a little contact button there. And the website itself is really sort of a treasure trove of free resources. So tool around a little bit, go to the resources page, the blog, and there's lots of articles that might be pertinent for your specific case.
Fantastic. Well, I could talk to you all day, and it was fascinating. Like I said, I had like this is informative to me for both purposes because it's very relevant in my life. And thank you so much for your time. What resonates with me most about this conversation is recognizing that early choices aren't about controlling every outcome, but about shaping the environment that supports curiosity, focus, and growth across years. Today, we explore practical steps families can start in the 0 to 3 window to lay the groundwork for confident teens. Dr. Dominique Padurano, thank you so much for sharing your clear-eyed view of how the first 3 years ripple through forward to teen focus, resilience, and success on big tasks and long projects. Your practical guidance on routines, language, play, sleep, and self-regulation gives families a map that they can actually follow. If you'd like to learn more about Dr. P's coaching and services with Crimson Coaching, visit Crimson Coaching's website and to explore tutoring, executive function coaching, and family-centered support. If this episode sparked new ideas, please subscribe to A Parent's Guide to Child Development, rate and review, and share with other families who want to invest early in their child's future so you can follow us for more tips and conversations that help families from day one. Thanks for tuning into A Parent's Guide to Child Development, where we decode milestones, demystify meltdowns, and occasionally question whether goldfish crackers count as a food group. Spoiler, they do. Make sure to follow us on Spotify and subscribe to our YouTube channel so you never miss an expert tip, breakthrough strategy, or aha moment that can make a big difference in your child's development. It's cheaper than therapy and less messy than glitter slime. We'll be back soon with more expert advice, real talk, and zero judgment. Until then, keep calm and try not to step on any Legos.